So let's talk about the more important distinction, which is discrete versus continuous variable. So when we talk about a discrete variable, the most important part to remember is that we have separate values, separate indivisible categories. What do we mean by that? So let's say that let's take an easy example, something that can be divided. Uh, let's say number of apples in a basket. Okay, let's say that we are not dividing those apples. The apples are staying whole. So within a basket, we can't have 3.5 apple because we're not dividing them. We're just organizing apples in baskets, right? So this is an example of discrete variable where we can't, and we don't have any number between 1 and 2, right? There's no number between 2 and 3. It's either 1 or 2 or 3 or and whatnot. So we are skipping a lot of values. So we're not hitting all the values to go to the next one. So we can skip, and we can go from 1 to 4 or 1 to 5 and whatnot. So I can have a basket with just 1 apple, another basket with 5 apples, and that would be perfectly fine, right? So in discrete variables, we have separate indivisible categories. So and there could be no values between the neighboring categories. So there could be no value between 1 and 2 or 2 and 3. Does that make sense to you? Because we're not, again, in this example, we're not splitting the apples. We're assuming that the apple is whole, right? So we can't have a basket that has 3.5 apples or 3 apple or 4 apples and a half. Now let's take the continuous. If we let's take the weight, for example. So in weight, when we're gaining weight or losing weight, we have to go through every single value between the initial weight and the final weight. So if I lost 3 pounds, let's say I was weighing 130 and I lost 3 pounds. So I am now 127. So I went through all the values between 130 and 120 to arrive to 127. I can't skip. My weight, when obviously I couldn't track it. It's impossible to track that the 3 pounds that I lost, right? I can't know at what moment did I lose a gram or 2 grams and whatnot. If anything, the weight fluctuates, but I know for sure that I went from 130 to 127 while hitting every single value. Would you agree?
Yes.
Does that make sense to you? So in continuous variable, we have a continuity. So we can't skip values. Like when the temperature gets up, it doesn't like we can't skip from 10 degrees to 15 degrees. We have to go through 10, 11, 12. We can have to go through all the values between 10 and 15 before we get to 15. Right? Versus in the discrete, where I can just put another apple in the basket and there I'm in the next value. Or I can add at once 3 apples, and then I have I skipped over 3 more values. Does that make sense? Can you give me other examples of discrete versus continuous variable that you know of?
So for discrete, what I can think of, let's say we have a bus in front of us and there are a certain number of seats in a bus also. So
Okay,
let's say
nice.
we can
Number?
only have the number of people in the bus
Yeah, that's good.
as to how many ever seats we have. We can't, and when it comes to, let's say, human beings or anything like that, in those terms, we can't have a half human being, how much ever you want to be
Yes.
present and not present, you still can't be half. So
Yeah.
yeah.
That's true. That's a
So
good example. Yeah,
yeah,
that's a very good example, actually. So those are two variables, number of people and number of seats. So
yeah,
we would have so we can't have a half seat. So we can't have
right,
a half seat. It's either one seat or zero seat, right? And we
exactly,
can't have a half human on the bus. It would be either a
right,
human or no human. Either a human attended the bus or didn't attend the bus. So that's a very good example of it. Thank you. Yes,
yeah.
and for continuous?
And for continuous, what I'm thinking, it just hit my mind right now. For let's say for someone's birthday, let's say somebody's turning 20-year old today, and exactly 1 year from now. So
Hmm.
this would be considered as a continuous variable because each day you are going one day, one day, one day, although you're not going to be tracking every day, okay, I'm 20 years and 3 days old, but eventually like it adds on, right? Like similarly how the time is a continuous variable,
Yes,
if
yeah, time is
my understand.
continuous variable.
So
Yeah, yeah.
so in a similar way, I guess a birthday would also make sense here. I could totally be wrong, but please feel free to
Well,
correct.
that's a very good example because it depends on the way you're analyzing the data. If you're analyzing years, it would be discrete, right? But
Right.
if you're analyzing like by days, for instance,
Day.
or by
Yeah.
hours, then yeah, it
Yeah.
would it would become continuous because and actually that's a very good point that you brought up. A discrete variable can become a continuous variable with a large amount of data. So when we
Right.
have a large amount of data, we approach a discrete variable to the behavior of a continuous variable. But it's not systematic. There are rules that should apply.
Right.
So we will cover those rules,
We'll probably
obviously,
get onto that, I guess, in the
in the
future.
future. So yeah, so there are rules that allow us to approach the behavior of a discrete variable under certain circumstances to a continuous variable. So we can use the same tools that we use for continuous variable to handle the discrete one. The reason why this distinction is important because we would have different laws, different tools for each type of a variable. So for discrete variable, we will use different tools than the tools that we are using for continuous variables to make interpretations, to make forecasting and whatnot. And usually, what we do is that usually, most frequently, we would have a collection of data that is a discrete data that we're trying to approach to a normal, to a continuous variable, so that we can use the normal distribution, we can use the student distribution and whatnot. So we will cover that in the future as well. So that's a very good point. It is possible to for a discrete variable to become a continuous variable, at least by approximation. Anyone else? Thank you, Shidan.
I'll try. So, for instance, like if you want to study the population of frogs in the forest, and we
Okay.
want to see like how they're growing, so we will maybe um, calculate like the number of eggs laid by frogs. So
Okay.
that would be discrete because it cannot be half of an egg. And
Yes.
then for
Good.
continues, it could be. I wanted to say first, like for instance, like salary. If we are in a company and we want to calculate
That's
salary, but
that's a good
you know,
example. That's a good example because a salary, so
but a salary
so
could
a
be also
salary can
like
hit
discrete and
any
continuous.
so the to answer this question, you should ask yourself, is there a value that a salary can't hit? Meaning that can we say that there's no salary between one value and the other? We can't because salary, like salaries have, like uh so it depends. Are we looking at the net or the gross? If we're talking about the gross, usually that's a discrete, because we go from 50K to
Yeah,
60K to 70K and whatnot, right? But if we're looking at the net, what the employee actually receives, that's a continuous, because like you are never getting the same exact amount. There's always a comma and some numbers after it, right? Depending on like the number of days that have passed, whether there were statutory holidays and so on, the taxes and whatnot. So if you look at your pay stub, there's always a variation in those numbers, right? So we can't know for sure that a certain number won't be hit, versus for the gross, there's no negotiation that goes, oh, I want 1053356, like that's not how negotiate. So we usually negotiate from one value to the other. So 50, 55, 60, 65, and whatnot. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, so if it is raw, then it is discrete, and then if it's like, if the moment we do some calculations like overtime or absences or nets, then it will become continuous.
Continuous, exactly. Because then we would have like we would go through all the values, because the values would change over time, versus the negotiation, where we negotiate from one level to the other without going through all the values. And the keyword here to keep in mind is infinite.
Okay.
For continuous, there's an infinite number of possibilities for the salary. For the discrete, there's a finite number of possibilities. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay. So let's, if no one has any questions, I can move on. And as I mentioned before, for the qualitative, we have the nominal scale and the ordinal scale. So in the nominal scale, there's no quantitative distinctions between these observations, as we mentioned, like the client ID. And in the ordinal scale, we have to have an ordered sequence. So we can't skip through the different sequences.